Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. This week we have another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is our 75th deck and it's titled Rograkh Digivolve To. And what he is digivolving to is going to be kept a little bit secret for a little while. But if you haven't seen this show before, what we are doing is randomly selecting a card from Scryfall.com, working with a budget of $100 or less, and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So really quickly, before we get into the deck tech itself, I do want to highlight some of the ways you can reach out to us or to help support the channel if that's something you're interested in doing. You can always find us on Twitter at 13POYNZ, Reddit u/POYNZ13. I do my best to post the links to the videos and everything else that we're doing on these locations, as well as asking questions of the community or just kind of talking to people. So if you ever want to reach out, those are great ways to do it. The other way to reach out is through email, dungeonlearnersguide@gmail.com. I'm more than happy to answer any questions there or talk to anyone through email. If maybe you feel more comfortable sending just an email rather than posting it publicly, that is perfectly fine. And then if you're looking to support the channel, you can head on over to TCG Player. We have an affiliate link down in the description below, where once you click on that link, any cards you buy, we get a little bit of a kickback from as a thank you for sending them a little bit of business. And then finally, the most direct way you can help support us is through Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide. There are several different tiers available at the $3, $5, and $7 level, where every month you'll give us a little bit of money, kind of as a thank you for putting out the content. And then you get, in return, of course, access to the deck techs a full week early, the guarantee or the promise that any cards you suggest will be made into videos for the channel. Depending on the tier, you may also get access to a Discord channel where we brew up some of the decks and also play some of the games. So if you're interested in being on the channel in some of the games, that would be a great way to do it. And finally, there's also the opportunity to get a random card sent to you every month. It would be one of the random cards done for this channel. And of course, the unedited gameplay videos, so you can hear the players speaking to each other and talking and laughing over top of the gameplay rather than just my own commentary. So if that is something you're interested in, please do subscribe to our patron over there, Dungeon Learner's Guide. And of course, we got to give a shout out to our 5 current patrons. We have William Swiftfoot, we have Doodle, Observer Will, Calvin Schmidt, and our newest patron, Eric Hui. So to the 5 of you, thank you very much for all of your support. And with all of that out of the way, all of the introductions done, let's jump into our deck tech. So this week, we have a random card, not chosen by a patron or anyone like that, just a completely random card from Scryfall.com, and this one is Transmogrify. And Transmogrify is 3 and a red for a sorcery that says exile target creature. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. That player puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles the rest into their library. So a little bit unique because we could use this on our opponent's creatures. We could exile something problematic, but that does mean that they could get a different creature to replace it. Maybe we'll get lucky and they'll get like a mana dork, something like that, but there's also the chance we get really unlucky and they get something huge like an Avenger of Zendikar, right? So what we're going to want to be doing actually is using it on our own creatures, which kind of plays back into the title of this video. And one of our commanders, Rograkh, partnered up with, of course, his best friend, Ishai, is going to be one of our main targets, because since Rograkh costs 0 mana, we could cast Transmogrify on Rograkh for a total of 4 mana invested into both cards. And we could digivolve Rograkh into, hopefully, something better than a 0/1, but you never know. Maybe we'll get super unlucky. But anyway, let's read through our commanders and then we can get into our themes for the deck. So our first one, Rograkh, Son of Roghah, is 0 mana for a 0/1 Kobold Warrior. Has First Strike, Menace, and Trample, and it has Partner. So we are, of course, partnering him up with Ishai Ojutai Dragonspeaker, which is 2 white and a blue for a 1/1 Bird Monk that has Flying, and whenever an opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Ishai Ojutai Dragonspeaker. Now, Both of these cards can put in a tremendous amount of work on their own. Rograkh can be incredibly terrifying considering all of his keywords, but honestly we're not using him too much for the keywords as much as we are for the 0 mana ability. And then Ishai is surprisingly strong because you're in a 4-player game, people are casting a ton of spells. Ishai can get very, very large very quickly, and I personally have an Ishai deck that can start knocking people out within a turn or two of it coming down. So a very powerful set of commanders, and I think that might work against us in the long run. But let's take a look at some of our themes, and then we'll kind of break down what this deck is trying to do. So since we are trying to Digivolve Rograkh, we are playing a bunch of what we'd call polymorph effects based off of Polymorph here. So things that, we'll just read Polymorph, we'll kind of explain it. It says 3 and a blue for sorcery. Destroy target creature. It can't be regenerated. Its controller reveals cards from the top of his or her library until he or she reveals a creature card. The player puts that card onto the battlefield, then shuffles all other cards revealed this way into their library. So very similar to Transmogrify, the only real difference being, well, of course the color, but also the fact that Polymorph destroys and Transmogrify exiles. So there is a chance we could get back the creature we destroy with Polymorph, but it's going to be unlikely, I'll be honest. And so, of course, we are destroying our own creatures or exiling our own creatures, which means we need things for Rograkh to digivolve into. We need the big threats. Things like Serra's Emissary, which is 4 white, white, white for a 7/7 angel. It's got flying. It's an angel, most of them do. And as Serra's Emissary enters the battlefield, choose a card type. You and creatures you control have protection from the chosen card type. Now, you could name anything with this. You could name planeswalkers or instants and sorceries, but honestly, I don't think I've ever seen someone cast Serra's Emissary and not name creatures, because at that point, all of your creatures have protection from creatures, so they can't be blocked, they can't be dealt damage by, and you also have protection from creatures, which means creatures can't do damage to you, so you never really have to worry about people attacking you. So Serra's Emissary is a phenomenal card. Personally, I think it should see a lot more play in Commander, but this is a great thing for Rograkh to digivolve into. And then finally, sometimes we might not have Rograkh, or we might have cast him too many times, so we do need some backup creatures to digivolve. So we do have things like Raise the Alarm to make some tokens, and Raise the Alarm is 1 and a white for an instant that just says create 2 1/1 white soldier creature tokens. So we have a ton of ways to make 2 or 3 tokens at a time to make sure that we always have something to hit with Polymorph or Transmogrify, and ensure that we can always get some of our big threats into play. But those are our themes for the deck. So a pretty straightforward deck this week, trying to play little dudes and make them into significantly larger dudes. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at some of our key cards for this deck. Some of the cards that are going to help us, well, hopefully help us get to a win and kind of synergize along the way. So first up, we have Divergent Transformations, and Divergent Transformations is a little bit weird, so we'll kind of break it down, but it's 6 and a red for an instant, and it has Undaunted, so it costs 1 less to cast for each opponent. So typically 7 mana, but if we have 3 opponents, it only costs 4? So I'm not great at math. Hopefully I got that right. And what it does is exile 2 target creatures. For each of those creatures, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card, put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest into their library. So for 4 mana at instant speed, we can digivolve 2 of our creatures. We can just shuffle them into our library. Well, we exile them and then start revealing cards from the top of our library to make sure that we could have massive threats on our opponent's end step. This could be in response to someone trying to remove some of our creatures. This could be in response to an opponent playing something that would prevent us from, being able to get creatures out of our library. This is just a great way to make sure that no matter what happens, we have an answer, or at least have a threat when it comes to our turn. We no longer have a 0/1 or a 1/1, we might have a big 7/7 flying angel. So Divergent Transformations, very powerful. Obviously not quite as powerful once it gets down to like 1-on-1, because then it does cast, Well, I guess it would still cast the 5 mana or 6 mana rather than 7, but still not ideal. We'd love to have it for 4. So, Divergent Transformations, great card, especially if there's 4 players in the table. But that leads us to our next key card, and that is one of our big hits in the deck, Sephara Sky's Blade. So Sephara, another 4 white, 7/7 angel, surprisingly. You may pay white and tap 4 untapped creatures you control with flying, rather than pay this spell's mana cost. That's probably not going to be super relevant, because honestly, we don't want to cast this card at all. We'd rather much cast something like Divergent Transformations. And Sephara has flying, lifelink, and other creatures you control with flying have indestructible. That is the reason this is a key card. A lot of our big threats have flying. And if Sephara can give a lot of our big threats indestructible, there's not much our opponents are going to be able to do. So for example, if we gave all of our creatures protection from creatures with Serra's Emissary, and then also gave Serra's Emissary indestructible with Sephara Sky's Blade, they would need to exile Sephara or exile Serra's Emissary to be able to deal with it. And that can be pretty tricky for certain decks to be able to do. Mono red isn't going to have a ton of access to exile. Mono blue probably won't. Even green isn't going to be able to do it too much. So this could be a great way to help protect our board and honestly protect our life total in the long run as well. So finally, we come to our last key card, and that is Showdown of the Scalds. And this is a weird one to have here, but I really want to talk about it in its relation to the deck itself. And it's also strange that this is probably the best card draw spell we have, and considering we're in Jeskai and have access to blue and blue-white, it's weird that our best card draw spell is red-white, but Showdown of the Scalds is 2 red-white for a saga, an enchantment saga, and as it enters the battlefield and after you draw, put a lore counter on it, sacrifice it after 3. At the first lore counter, we exile the top 4 cards of our library, and until the end of our next turn, we may play those cards. Lore Saga 2 and 3, whenever you cast a spell this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So this is incredibly useful for a couple of reasons. One, it's 4 mana, draw 4 cards, essentially, because we can play those cards. So even if we manage to hit lands, we can still play them from exile. And whenever we're casting spells for the next 2 turns after we cast this, we are making our threats bigger. That means Sephara is going from a 7/7 to an 8/8 or a 9/9, maybe even a 10/10. We can turn our big threats into even bigger threats while still making sure that we have the cards that we need in hand, or in this case, in exile, to be able to cast. So yeah, it is a little bit weird that one of our best card draw spells is a Boros spell, but this is another card that I honestly think should see a lot more play in Commander than it does, because it is surprisingly powerful, even if people destroy it after the first lore counter, because then we've already gotten the 4 cards. And if you have ways to manipulate counters or bring it back, you can kind of keep doing that. So honestly, Showdown of the Scalds, amazing card. You should play it more, and in this deck especially, also just great. So that leads us to the end of our key cards section, and the next thing that I would like to do is take a look at some cool interactions, some ways that cards work super well together, and again, hopefully, try to lead us to a victory. So first up, we have Diluvian Primordial and Hullbreaker Horror, which is a little bit difficult to call this a cool interaction because they are both 7 mana, so it would be tricky to get them both. However, we've seen earlier that we have ways to polymorph multiple creatures at once, so it is possible that we just kind of flip both of these onto the table at the same time. And if that's the case, that's exactly what we're wanting. So, Diluvian Primordial, 5 blue for a 5/5 avatar with flying. When it enters the battlefield, for each opponent, you may cast up to 1 target instant or sorcery card from that player's graveyard without paying its mana cost. If a card cast this way would be put into a graveyard this turn, exile it instead. So this lets us cast 3 spells, considering we have 3 other players. And if we combine that with Hullbreaker Horror, which is also 5 blue for a 7/8 Kraken Horror, it's got flash, this spell can't be countered, and Whenever you cast a spell, choose up to 1. You could either return target spell you don't control to its owner's hand, or return target non-land permanent to its owner's hand. So the key interaction between these two cards is if we have Diluvian Primordial come into play, we could then cast 1 instant or sorcery from each opponent's graveyard, and the key there is that it casts the instant or sorcery. That triggers Hullbreaker Horror 3 separate times, and if we wanted, we could return 2 things our opponents control to their hands, and then return the Diluvian Primordial to our hand, so we can do this again next turn. And at some point, it gets pretty difficult for our opponents to answer this, because as long as we have some sort of spell in hand, preferably an instant, so we can do it in response, we can kind of make sure that the Hullbreaker Horror stays protected. Because even if we have to bounce back our opponent's kill spells or bounce back board wipes, we can always just use the Hullbreaker Horror to actually bounce itself back to our hand. It doesn't say another target non-land permanent. So there are a ton of sneaky interactions between these two cards, especially because Diluvian Primordial is letting us cast multiple instants and sorceries when it comes in. So I'm sure there's a ton of cool stuff that can be done with these two. But that is just the first of our cool interaction. We do, of course, still have our next cool interaction, which is Saheeli Sublime Artificer and Synthetic Destiny. So Saheeli is 1 and a hybrid Izzet mana. And she's a legendary planeswalker. Saheeli comes in with 5 loyalty. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, create a 1/1 colorless servo artifact creature token. And, -2, target artifact you control becomes a copy of another target artifact or creature you control until the end of turn, except it's an artifact in addition to its other types. We're probably not going to be using the -2 very often. It could be relevant that we turn maybe like a Soul Ring into, a big threat like a Sarah's Emissary, but that's not going to be too common for us. Really, we want it for the passive ability, the ability to cast a non-creature spell and make a 1/1 servo. And that becomes relevant when we combine it with Synthetic Destiny, which is 4 blue for an instant. Exile all creatures you control. At the beginning of the next end step, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal that many creature cards. Put all creature cards revealed this way onto the battlefield, then shuffle the rest of the revealed cards into your library. So if we exile 2 cards, we get to reveal until we hit 2 creatures and put them into play. The neat thing about Synthetic Destiny is that it's an instant, which we talked about earlier, being an instant, super relevant. We can do this at our opponent's, well, I was going to say we could do it at their end step, but don't do it at their end step. Do it before they go to end step, so that way when they move to their end step, you get the creatures. You got to make sure that you don't accidentally do it on their end step, and then you don't get the creatures till your end step. That wouldn't be ideal. But the reason these two cards work so well together is because Saheeli works on cast. When you cast Synthetic Destiny, it automatically triggers Saheeli making a servo, meaning that if you had no creatures on board, you would still get a servo, so that when Synthetic Destiny resolved, it would still see that you had a creature, and you would still get at least 1 trigger. Now, obviously, we want more than 1 trigger, but that's like worst case scenario. As long as we have Saheeli, there's a good chance we have a lot of different servos, and therefore could get a lot of different creatures with Synthetic Destiny. So that's why I would recommend using these two together. And of course, they're great cards on their own, but I do think they really shine together. So that leads us to the end of our cool interactions. And since this is a budget show, we of course got to talk a little bit about the budget of the deck. And this week we came in at $97.69, which is pretty close to our budget limit. But honestly, a big portion of that is because of one particular card. And this is a card that's been rising in price quite a bit lately, so I think if you don't have one and you want one, I would recommend probably picking it up because it's seeing play in Modern and Pioneer and a whole bunch of other formats. And that card is Indomitable Creativity. And Indomitable Creativity is currently X red. It's for a sorcery that says destroy X target artifacts and or creatures. For each permanent destroyed this way, its controller reveals cards from the top of their library until an artifact or creature card is revealed and exiles that card. Those players put the exiled cards onto the battlefield, then shuffle their libraries. And that is currently $15.64. So if you wound up cutting this card from the deck, you're looking at about $82 for the entire deck, which is much more manageable than $97. So Indomitable Creativity, while amazing because it lets us kind of pick and choose how many things we destroy, is honestly not 100% what we want for the deck, because we do run Mana Rocks, we're Jeskai, we got to ramp somehow. So there is a chance that you destroy 3 creatures and then just flip into 3 different signets. So obviously it's unlikely that that happens, but it's not impossible. So I would highly recommend, maybe if you run Indomitable Creativity, it might be worth kind of trimming down on some of the artifacts, but still a very good card nonetheless, and can be a great way to turn a ton of tokens into much bigger threats. It is, like I said, however, still about $15, so if you do need to cut it for budget reasons, that is perfectly fine. However, if you're looking to actually maybe increase the price of this deck and you want to check out some cards that are a little bit out of the budget, I have 2 different recommendations for you this week of things that are out of budget and what I would replace them with. So the first one is going to be Proteus Staff, which is 3 mana for an artifact, and you can pay 2 and a blue, tap, put target creature on the bottom of its owner's library. That creature's controller reveals cards from the top of their library until they reveal a creature card. The player puts that card into play, and the rest on the bottom of their library in any order. Play this ability only anytime you could play a sorcery. So Proteus Staff, the key reason that this is here is because this is a reusable polymorph effect, and it doesn't destroy the creature, it doesn't exile the creature, it puts it on the bottom of our library. So if we are forced to use it on one of our big threats, like, say, the Sarah's Emissary, we're not destroying it or exiling it, we could get it back later. So Proteus Staff is repeatable, it's a polymorph effect, it doesn't destroy our stuff. Yeah, we can only do it at sorcery speed, which is a little bit of a downside, but once it's in play, it's only 3 mana to activate, which is a lot cheaper than most other polymorph effects, so Proteus Staff really pulls a lot of weight when it comes to what we want to do with this deck. And the card that I would recommend actually swapping for it is technically another repeatable polymorph effect, but in a very different way. So Shifting Shadow is the card that I would replace, which is 2 and a red for an enchantment aura, enchant creature. Enchanted creature has haste, and at the beginning of your upkeep, destroy this creature. Reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card. Put that card onto the battlefield and attach Shifting Shadow to it. Then put all other cards revealed this way on the bottom of your library in a random order. So Shifting Shadow is, like I said, a repeatable polymorph effect, but unfortunately it destroys the creature that it's on, and it also forces us to do this every single turn. Proteus Staff, we can pick and choose when it happens. Shifting Shadow, we might destroy, one of our little tokens, get a huge, massive creature that could win us the game in a couple of turns, and then we have to destroy it and get something else. So Shifting Shadow can be very good. I think it would be very good if we had a way to manipulate what was on the top of our deck, or maybe put creatures back into our library, or if we had ways to make our permanents indestructible, which does lead me to our second out-of-budget upgrade, which is Avacyn, Angel of Hope. And so if we had Avacyn, Shifting Shadow would be pretty good because it's giving all of our stuff indestructible. So we could technically put Shifting Shadow on Avacyn, it's indestructible, it says destroy, then get another creature. It doesn't say the creature has to die. We could use Avacyn to make our stuff indestructible and then keep getting creatures into play. But we should probably read what Avacyn does first. So Avacyn, Angel of Hope, is 5 white for an 8/8 angel, flying, vigilance, indestructible, and other permanents you control have indestructible. This is a bomb in this deck. It is incredibly powerful. It does really so much, because making everything indestructible means that we survive board wipes, we survive targeted removal, we survive combat. There's not much that's going to kill our board once Avacyn's in play. And yeah, they could exile Avacyn and then board wipe, or they could mass exile everything. That is still a possibility, but it takes away the number of board wipes that actually hurt us, and really makes it much easier for us to keep pushing and keep making a threat on the board. And so if you put Avacyn in, who is currently a massive $35 right now, I would recommend swapping out Jalira, Master Polymorphist, which is 3 and a blue for a 2/2 human wizard. You can pay 2 and a blue, tap, sacrifice another creature, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a non-legendary creature card, put that card onto the battlefield, and the rest on the bottom in a random order. And this might look super strange to you because I was just talking about how great Proteus Staff is, the fact that we can reuse it, the fact that it's just 3 mana, tap, which is a lot cheaper than our other stuff, and Jalira really does all of the exact same things. The only difference is, 1, she makes us sacrifice the creature, which is worse than putting it on the bottom in this deck, and she only hits non-legendary creatures. If we look at the deck without upgrades like Avacyn, we have a total of 15 creatures in the deck. 8 of them are legendary. So Jalira can only hit less than half of our creatures, which is not really what we want to do. And we do have some very powerful non-legendary creatures. I keep going back to Serra's Emissary. Play more Serra's Emissary in Commander. But the reason that Jalira isn't as great as we want it to be is because sometimes we might need something like Avacyn, for example, if she were in the deck, or Sephara to make things indestructible, and we just can't hit them with Jalira. So it is very relevant that Jalira can't hit non-legendaries, and I think especially if you're adding a legendary creature to the deck with Avacyn, it makes more sense to take out Jalira because that's fewer creatures that she's going to be able to hit. So that's my recommendation for the out of budget upgrade section. Let me know what you think. Let me know if there are any other cards that you would recommend swapping in or swapping out. I would love to hear all of that. But that does lead us to the final aspect of this deck tech, and that is seeing how the deck performs in a game. So this week we have 3 opponents. We have AngryCow, who is playing Guillaume, Master Chef. We have Bilal playing Ayara, First of Locthwain, and we have Mike playing Prosh, Sky Raider of Care. So I am very interested to see how this week's game goes. If I'm being perfectly honest, each of our opponents has black in their color identity, so I am very concerned about removal from everyone at the table, because removal can really fizzle a lot of what we're trying to do. Polymorph affects target, Transmogrify targets something, so if our creatures are removed in response, we don't get the Polymorph effect. So that is something to be aware of. But let's break down each of these commanders and then talk a little bit about the game. So first up, Cow's Guillaume Master Chef is kind of like a junk deck. He wants to make a ton of clues, food, and treasure tokens, and just make sure that he's always kind of rolling in artifact tokens. I'm very interested to see how this deck functions. I've actually never played against a clue/treasure/food deck, so I honestly don't know quite what to expect. But I mean, his commander's a troll warlock that's a chef, so I can't really complain there, but I feel like I should be scared of it. I'm just not 100% sure why, honestly. Next up, we have Bilal in his Ayara First of Locthwain deck. Most of Bilal's mono-black decks tend to be pretty terrifying. It's stuff like, making 15 mana by turn 5 with Cabal Coffers, and then playing a Grey Merchant of Asphodel and draining everybody out for 1 billion. So I am pretty terrified of what Bilal's going to do with Ayara. I would imagine it's just kind of mono-black synergies. The fact that his commander has 3 black pips in the casting cost is also pretty scary. The fact that it drains when creatures come in and draws cards. There's a lot happening here, and I'm very worried about it in general. And then finally is Mike's Prosh, Sky Raider of Care. This is a deck that, while not CEDH level, is a very powerful deck. He does have cards like Food Chain in it to go infinite with his commander. I've lost against this deck multiple times, but I am very excited to see what we can do against it, because I know Prosh, I don't want to say is very straightforward, because it's not. There's always a lot of lines and always a lot of, interesting things that he can do in the deck. But it does rely very heavily on things like Prosh and sacrifice outlets. So I think if we can kind of keep that in control, maybe make sure we have some counter spells for some important pieces, we might be okay. So looking at these three commanders, I think if we have interaction, then the deck I'm probably most scared about is going to be Guillaume, because I'm not sure if we're going to be able to interact with artifacts too much. If we don't have interaction, I think the deck I'm most scared about is Prosh, because I know how quickly and how terrifying Prosh can go off. So we will see how this goes. I'm very interested to see this game. I hope you all are as well, and I will let you know how it goes after the game, and I'll talk to you then. At the start of the game, I go first, followed by AngryCow, Bilal, and Mike. On my first turn, I play a Myriad Landscape. Cow plays a Forest and casts Llanowar Elves. Bilal plays a Myriad Landscape. Mike plays a Swamp and then casts Viscera Seer, which can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. I play an Island and cast my commander, Rograkh, son of Roghah. Cow plays a Swamp and casts Tireless Provisioner, which makes a food or treasure token whenever Cow plays a land. Bilal plays a Swamp. Mike attacks Bilal for 1, and then plays a Mountain, and in his second main phase casts Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Viscera Seer to search his library for a card and put it into his hand. He then casts the card he tutored for, a Mox Diamond, discarding a land when it comes into play. Notably, this is a Mox Diamond with art based on Mike's own comic book, so everyone comment down below and let him know how awesome his art is. On my turn, I play a Plains. Cow casts Chatterfanged Squirrel General, letting him make a squirrel token whenever he makes another token, and also allowing him to sacrifice X squirrels to give target creature plus X minus X until end of turn. This lets him play a Forest, making a treasure token with the Provisioner, and also a squirrel token with Chatterfang. He then attacks Mike for 3 and passes. Bilal plays a Swamp and sacrifices his Myriad Landscape to search his library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. Mike casts a Squee the Immortal, and then plays a Stomping Ground tapped. And then, at the end of turn, I also sacrifice my Myriad Landscape to search my library for 2 basic lands, putting them into play tapped. On my turn, I play a Mountain and cast Fireflux Squad, which has haste and, when it attacks, allows me to exile another attacking creature, then reveal cards from the top of my library until I reveal a creature, putting it into play tapped and attacking. I move to combat and attack Mike for 4 and Bilal for 0, but Fireflux Squad triggers, exiling Rograkh and putting Jalira, Master Polymorphist, in his place, hitting Bilal for 2. Cow attacks Mike for 3 with Chatterfang since it has Forest Walk, and me for 3 with the Provisioner. Then in the second main phase, casts his commander Guillaume Master Chef, creating a food token at the end of turn for each non-token creature that entered the battlefield this turn, and also allowing him to sacrifice a food to tap target creature and give it indestructible. Then he moves to his end step, making a food and a squirrel. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts his commander Ayara, First of Locthwain, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life whenever a black creature enters under his control. He then casts Gifted Aetherborn, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life. Mike plays a Phyrexian Tower and sacrifices Squee to the tower, making 2 black mana, so he can cast his commander Prosh, Sky Raider of Care, making 6 Kobold tokens when it enters since he paid 6 mana for it, and also giving him the ability to sacrifice a creature and give Prosh +1/+0 until end of turn. I play a Mountain and attack Cow for 4 and Bilal for 2, but this triggers Fireflux Squad, so I exile Jalira and turn her into Velomachus Lorehold, doing 5 to Bilal instead, while Cow blocks with a squirrel, killing the token but taking no damage. Then in my second main phase, I cast my commander Ishai Ojutai Dragonspeaker, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent casts a spell. In Cow's turn, he uses Chatterfang to sacrifice a squirrel, killing Ishai, and then casts Inspiring Statuary, giving all his non-artifact spells improvise, letting him tap his artifacts to cast them. He moves to combat, attacking me for 5 with Guillaume, and Mike for 3 with Chatterfang. Bilal plays a Cabal Coffers and also casts Endrick Sar Master Breeder, which makes X 0/1 Thrall tokens whenever he casts a creature spell where X is that spell's mana value. This also makes each of his opponents lose a life when Bilal gains a life, and then he casts Forsworn Paladin, making a Thrall token and making each opponent lose 2 life while he gains 2 life. Finally, he activates Ayara, sacrificing the Thrall to draw a card, which draws him into a Sign in Blood, which he casts, drawing 2 cards and losing 2 more life. Mike plays a Mountain, and then sacrifices a Kobold to Phyrexian Tower so he can cast Protean Hulk, which allows him to search his library for any number of creatures with total mana value 6 or less and put them into play when the Hulk dies. Knowing this can kill us, I respond by casting Swords to Plowshares, exiling Prosh so that Mike doesn't have a sacrifice outlet this turn. He does, however, sacrifice all his kobolds to make Prosh have 10 power, gaining 10 life when my spell resolves. On my turn, I play an island and recast Rograkh. I then move to combat, attacking Cow for 4 and Mike for 5 in the air. This triggers both creatures, but I choose not to use the Fire Flux squad. Then Velomachus' ability resolves, letting me look at the top 7 cards of my library and cast an instant or sorcery, mana value 5 or less, without paying its mana cost. This lets me cast Reality Shift, exiling Protean Hulk and letting Mike manifest the top card of his library. Cow casts a Tireless Tracker, making a clue token whenever land enters under his control, and also getting a +1/+1 counter whenever Cow sacrifices a clue. He then plays a Swamp, getting a treasure, a clue, and 2 squirrels, before moving to combat and attacking Bilal for 5 with Guillaume and Mike for 3 with Chatterfang. Then in his second main phase, he casts Mazarek Crawl Death Priest, allowing him to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature he controls whenever any player sacrifices a permanent. Then at the end of turn, Guillaume triggers, making Cow 2 food tokens and also 2 squirrel tokens. On Bilal's turn, he activates Ayara, sacrificing Forsworn Paladin to draw a card. This also puts a +1/+1 counter on all of Cow's creatures. Then, Bilal casts the Haunt of Hightower, which gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent discards a card. This triggers Endrick Sar, making 6 Thrall tokens. In response though, Cow activates Chatterfang, sacrificing a treasure and 3 squirrels, to give Ayara +3/-3, killing her and preventing us from losing any life, while Cow also puts 4 +1/+1 counters on all of his creatures. Mike plays a Swamp and sacrifices his Manifest to Phyrexian Tower, putting another +1/+1 counter on all of Cow's creatures, and giving Mike the mana to recast Prosh, making 8 Kobold tokens. I play an island and attack Cow with everything, triggering Velomachus and Fireflux Squad. I resolve the Velomachus trigger first, looking at the top 7 cards of my library and casting Fumigate without paying its mana cost. This destroys all creatures and gains me a total of 26 life since it destroys 26 creatures, but does stop any combat damage I would have dealt. In response, Cow sacrifices a food, putting a counter on all of his creatures to give his commander indestructible, letting it survive the board wipe. In my second main phase, I recast my commander Rograkh, and this lets me cast Reality Scramble, putting Rograkh on the bottom of my library and then revealing cards from the top of my library until I reveal a creature, putting it into play. I wind up hitting Stormtide Leviathan, turning all lands into islands in addition to their other types, and preventing creatures without Island Walk or flying from attacking. Cow casts a Ruthless Technomancer, sacrificing Guillaume when it enters to make 12 treasures since Guillaume had 12 power. He then activates the Technomancer, sacrificing 5 artifacts to return Mazarek to play from the graveyard. He then sacrifices 2 treasures to cast Vraska Relic Seeker, activating her -3 ability to destroy Stormtide Leviathan and create a treasure token. He sacrifices another treasure, putting a total of 3 +1/+1 counters on each of his creatures to cast Underhanded Designs, letting him pay a mana when an artifact goes to the graveyard to make each opponent lose a life while he gains a life, and it can also be sacrificed to destroy target creature. Bilal casts Heartless Summoning, giving his creatures -1/-1, but making them cost 2 less to cast. This lets him cast Lorcan Warlock Collector, allowing him to pay life equal to the mana value of any creature that goes to an opponent's graveyard and return it to play under his control. He also cast Woe Strider, making a 0/1 goat token that immediately dies to Heartless Summoning, but it does let him sacrifice a creature to scry 1. Mike plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Cow's graveyard, and then casts Deathrite Shaman. I play a Terramorphic Expanse and recast my commander Ishai Ojutai Dragonspeaker. Cow recasts his commander Guillaume, putting a counter on Ishai. He then activates Vraska's -3 ability, killing the Planeswalker to destroy Lorcan. But in response, Bilal sacrifices it to scry 1, preventing Cow from making a treasure token, but still putting a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. Cow then moves to combat, attacking Bilal for 7 and me for 7 as well. In his second main phase, he casts Treasure Map, putting a counter on Ishai, and at the end of turn, Guillaume triggers, making a food token. Bilal plays a Swamp and casts Pontiff of Blight, giving all of his creatures Extort and putting a counter on Ishai. He also casts Phyrexian Arena, letting him draw a card and lose a life in his upkeep, putting another counter on Ishai and extorting twice, making each opponent lose 2 life while he gains 6. Mike casts Korvold Fey Cursed King, sacrificing a swamp when it enters and being able to draw a card whenever he sacrifices a permanent. This puts a counter on Ishai and lets Cow put a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. Mike then plays a swamp, and at the end of turn, I sacrifice my Terramorphic Expanse to search my library for a basic land and put it into play tapped, also letting Cow put a +1/+1 counter on all of his creatures. I also cast Raise the Alarm, creating 2 1/1 soldier tokens. On my turn, I cast Indomitable Creativity, destroying both of my soldier tokens and revealing cards from the top of my library until I reveal 2 artifacts or creatures, putting them into play. This unfortunately only winds up hitting a Boros Locket and a Zorius Signet. Then at the end of turn, Cow sacrifices a treasure to activate Treasure Map, scrying 1 and putting a +1/+1 counter on his creatures. On Cow's turn, he casts Witch's Oven, letting him sacrifice a creature to create a food token, or 2 food tokens if the creature had power 4 or greater, also putting another counter on Ishai, and paying for Underhanded Designs, making each opponent lose a life while Cow gains a life. He then attacks Bilal for 9 with Guillaume, and me for 10. In Bilal's upkeep, he loses a life and draws a card, plays a swamp, and recasts his commander Ayara, making each opponent lose a life while he gains a life. He also extorts twice, making each opponent lose another 2 life while he gains 6 and puts a counter on Ishai. After that, he casts Corlash Heir to Blackblade, which can be regenerated for 2 mana and also has power and toughness equal to the number of swamps Bilal controls, currently being a 7/7. He also extorts it 3 times, making each opponent lose a total of 4 life while he gains 10. This also puts a counter on Ishai. Then at the end of turn, Mike activates Deathrite Shaman, exiling a swamp from his graveyard to make a green mana, and then sacrifices it with Phyrexian Tower to cast Court of Calling for X = 4, letting him search his library for a creature with mana value 4 or less, putting it into play. This puts a counter on Ishai, Korvold, draws Mike a card, and a +1/+1 counter on Cow's creatures. Then Mike puts Purphoros, God of the Forge into play, doing 2 damage to each opponent whenever a creature enters under his control. On Mike's turn, he casts Garruk Cursed Huntsman, triggering Ishai, and activates Garruk's -3 ability to destroy Mazarek and draw a card. But in response, Cow sacrifices a food token to tap him and make him indestructible instead, also putting a counter on all of his creatures. Mike then plays Ziatora's Proving Ground and attacks Cow with Korvold, sacrificing Garruk on attacks to put a counter on it and draw a card, putting a counter on all of Cow's creatures as well, but hitting him for a total of 7 damage. Then in Mike's second main phase, he casts Once Upon a Time, triggering Ishai and looking at the top 5 cards of his library, putting Acidic Slime from among them into his hand. At the end of turn, I sacrifice my Boros Locket to draw 2 cards, putting another counter on all of Cow's creatures. On my turn, I cast Urabrask the Hidden, giving all my creatures haste and making all my opponent's creatures enter the battlefield tapped. I then move to combat, attacking Cow with Urabrask for 4. In my second main phase, I play an Is It Boilerworks, returning a mountain to my hand, and at the end of turn, Cow activates Treasure Map, scrying 1. And then he immediately activates it again in his upkeep, scrying 1 and transforming it into Treasure Cove, making 3 treasures. This lets him pay 3 mana for Underhanded Designs, making each opponent lose 3 life while he gains 3. He also sacrifices 3 treasures, putting 3 more counters on all of his creatures. That lets him cast Academy Manufacturer, entering tapped and triggering Ishai, so now, whenever he would create a treasure, food, or clue token, he instead creates one of each. Then before combat, I cast Generous Gift to destroy Mazarek and let him create a 3/3 elephant token. But, in response, Cow sacrifices 3 treasures, putting 3 counters on all of his creatures. Then, he sacrifices Academy Manufacturer to Witch's Oven, creating 2 food tokens. This lets him sacrifice the food token and another treasure token to tap Mazarek and make him indestructible, putting 3 more counters on all of his creatures. Finally, he activates Ruthless Technomancer, using 3 treasures and sacrificing 3 artifacts to return Academy Manufacturer to play, putting 6 more counters on all of his creatures. This allows him to attack Mike for 17, knocking him out of the game, and attacks Bilal for 24 with Guillaume, doing exactly 10 commander damage through his blockers to put him at 24 total commander damage, also knocking Bilal out of the game. Then at the end of turn, Guillaume triggers, creating a food, treasure, and clue. On my turn, I play a Plains and recast my commander Rograkh. Then I discard a mountain to retrace Reality Scramble, putting Rograkh on the bottom of my library and revealing Nezahal Primal Tide from the top of my deck, putting it into play. I move to combat, attacking Cow with everything, but before damage, he sacrifices Underhanded Designs, putting 3 counters on all of his creatures and destroying Ishai, meaning I only do 11 damage to him. Second main phase, I cast Mass Polymorph, exiling Nezahal and Urabrask, letting me reveal cards from the top of my library until I reveal 2 creatures, putting them into play. This winds up hitting Serra's Emissary, which gives me and my creatures protection from creatures, and Medomai the Ageless. Unfortunately, Cow is unable to find an answer to the Serra's Emissary on his turn, so he decides to concede, knowing he's dead to my flyers, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a super sweet game. The ending especially, very cool. Unfortunately, even though I won, it is a little bit tainted, and I do have to apologize to AngryCow for this, but I noticed, and this is something I actually noticed when I was recording the video itself. I had done all the editing, we had played the game. I noticed that when I cast Reality Scramble on my last turn, I forgot to pay the mana for it, which means I didn't have the mana available to cast Mass Polymorph, which flipped me into Serra's Emissary and helped me win the game. So unfortunately, I was actually dead on board, and it should have been Cow's game, but I made a mistake. That one's on me, so we're all human. Things happen. All I know is hopefully next time I can catch my mistakes a little bit better. It is unfortunate that it played into the end of the game, but again, what can you really do? It's already happened, so hopefully that doesn't make the game less entertaining. I still think it was a super sweet game. All of the decks really did some sweet things. I'm very impressed with our deck in particular. I know that sounds kind of self-centered, but I was very impressed with how the Transmogrify, the polymorph effects really worked. I'd never played with them in Commander before, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. But I think the fact that we were able to continuously trigger the effects and kind of keep getting very threatening creatures in play, even if they were removed somehow, was very sweet, and a very fun play pattern too, because it was kind of random. You never knew what you were going to get. You didn't know if it was going to be terrible for you or terrible for the table, and I think that's kind of fun. The other decks, Prosh, as always, absolutely terrifying. Mike's Prosh deck is super scary, and there were multiple times throughout the game where he was, tutoring up cards, and I think if he didn't want to tutor up his own Mox Diamond and kind of show off his artwork, I think we probably could have died to a food chain combo. So I am very appreciative that he wanted to showcase some of his skills rather than just kill us. That's very nice of him. And then Ayara from Bilal, also very terrifying. I wasn't expecting the extort to be playing such a big role once he cast his extort creatures, but it really made a difference in the game because when he died, he was still in the 30s for life total. I think that if he'd been given 1 or 2 more turns, he very easily could have drained out the rest of the table. And then finally, Cow's Guillaume deck was kind of the all-star of this game, very much the MVP, as Cow's decks usually tend to be. Very impressive showing from the Troll Warlock. I wasn't expecting the level of power that came from it, but I think the real lesson from the Guillaume deck is that Mazarek right now is kind of an underrated piece. And I say underrated, but he's still $7, $8, something like that. But the amount of sacrifice that happens in a game of Commander at this point means Mazarek can make your board incredibly terrifying. So between the treasures and the food and the clues and Prosh making kobolds and Ayara sacking to draw cards and, even things like Terramorphic Expanse and Evolving Wilds, or even just I cracked a Boros Locket at one point, it was really impressive to see just how many things get sacrificed in a game of Commander. And I think this really proves that if you're looking for a great way to hate on your opponent's artifacts or hate on treasures, Mazarek really seems to be pulling his weight. So I would highly recommend looking into something like that. And he's a legend, so you could also just build around it and build like an anti-treasure deck if that's something you're interested in. So that is the game for this week. That's the deck for this week. I hope you all enjoyed it. Please do like the video, subscribe to the channel if you did. If you have any suggestions for future cards that you would like to see built around, or suggestions for just different types of videos in general, I'm actually looking into doing some other content as well. I would love to go back and make videos about some of the old Commander decks I made before I started making videos and kind of showcase those. I've thought about doing a little bit of Pioneer content. Eventually, I'll get back into Dungeons and Dragons as well, do something with that. So if you have suggestions for videos that you would like to see, please do let me know. I'm really hoping to kind of expand what we're doing with the Dungeon Learner's Guide. So thank you very much to everyone for watching. And like I said earlier, please do like and subscribe to the channel. But otherwise, I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.